Good afternoon. Welcome to this RSIS seminar on net assessment, how to think about major discontinuities in the global order by Dr. Adam Garfinkle. This will be the second in the series of seminars by Dr. Garfinkle. One of the big questions facing governments at this point in time is what can be done to better anticipate and prepare for threats such as rapidly evolving transnational terrorist challenges, slow burn threats like climate change, and global pandemics like the current COVID-19 pandemic. On the issue of epidemics and pandemics, although many countries have experienced previous outbreaks like SARS, MERS, and H1N1, for instance, it still seems that many governments were not well prepared for the current COVID-19 crisis. It would not have been for lack of trying. In Singapore, for example, after the Al-Qaeda-linked Jamaah Islamiyah terrorist arrests in December 2001 and the SARS outbreak 2 years later, the government put in place a systematic risk assessment and horizon scanning process, which was a project that also involved RSIS research contributions as well. This was what Singapore tried to do. Other countries grappled with similar horizon scanning and risk assessment systems and methodologies to try and anticipate major discontinuities in the global order as well. To share with us this afternoon about the US experience of what has been called net assessment and what enduring lessons it holds for us today, we are pleased to have with us once again our distinguished visiting fellow, Dr. Adam Garfinkle. Aside from being founding editor of the policy journal, The American Interest, Adam has served as editor of the National Interest, as well as held other senior US government and academic positions. He will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and after that, we shall have a discussion on key takeaways. Please note that you can post your questions in the YouTube chat box, which you should be able to see on your screen. With that, Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. It's nice to be back. Those of you who were here last week for this webinar, welcome back. And those of you who weren't here last week probably didn't miss too much, so don't worry about it. Before I get started on the substance, I just want to make a couple of very quick remarks about the circumstances that we're in. First of all, as I think I mentioned before last week, I don't have a printer and I don't have written notes. So what I've done is I've stacked another screen above the screen that the webinar is being broadcast on. So if I have to look up from time to time to see my notes, I apologize for that if it's distracting, but I don't have a lot of choices. Second thing I want to just mention quickly is that my own sense is that in a half an hour talk, webinar talk, there's not a whole lot you can really do to convey a complex subject. So my ambitions are fairly modest, and yours ought to be as well. Really, all I think I can do is stimulate some questions and imagination, and give people just a hint of what we're talking about here. And I want to finally say before I get going that, I am not claiming to be a great expert in with experience in net assessment. I know something about it from a variety of things I've done with the government and from some liaison I've had with the U.S. intelligence community, but I'm by no means a consummate expert on the subject. I haven't worked in it for year after year, decade after decade. So the best I can do is give you a glancing blow, so to speak, about what this subject is about. And I'll just, like everybody else these days, and just try to do the best I can. Okay, so I think we all are aware that intelligence communities all over the world, as well as large corporations that have risk assessment cells, have all kinds of methodologies that they use for planning. And some of that planning involves the study of radical discontinuities, of which what I call COVID-ageddon, I think certainly qualifies as a radical discontinuity. Now, people were honing such methods long before Nassim Taleb came along with the idea of a black swan to describe a radical discontinuity, as if the naming made any difference, except it made him some money. So there's a long history of various kinds of efforts to find methods that can give governments and decision makers in the private sector a synoptic grasp of what is happening so that they can plan accordingly. One net assessment is a kind of a subfield or a sub-aspect of the planning operation in general. It was developed originally by a man named Andrew Marshall, and it was designed to be used by the Department of Defense. And it was designed to be used in the Department of Defense in the office that was created for it, the Office of Net Assessment, ONA. It was designed and created for basically three purposes. The first was to generate threat and opportunity scenarios to guide Department of Defense acquisition decisions and strategy. Because it takes so long to create weapon systems, you have to imagine that you can see around the curve of the future and develop systems that are appropriate for the kinds of missions you think you'll need down the road. The second purpose of net assessment was to inform or to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and especially the J5, which is the Strategy, Engagement, and Programs Directorate of the JCS, which, and I'm quoting, contributes to the achievement of the commander's directed end states by developing command strategic guidance, planning military campaigns and operations. And the third purpose of creating the Office of Net Assessment in the Department of Defense was so that the Defense Department could liaise more effectively with other agencies within the intelligence community in the United States, notably the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is part and parcel of the Defense Department, the National Security Agency, which is also part and parcel of the Defense Department, but also with INR, the Bureau of Intelligence Research in the State Department, and more recently with elements, the intelligence assessment elements within the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. So most of the time, net assessment's been used not to study radical discontinuities. It's been used basically to just look ahead so that the Defense Department can, be more rational about the kinds of choices it has to make within the budget constraints it operates under. But it has been used to, it has been adjusted to be used to quick study radical discontinuities. The radical discontinuities that it has been used for, in one case a precursor of net assessment, took place before the office was established, it's been used at least 3 times. Something like net assessment has been used 3 times. The first was the original Solarium project, which was created during the Eisenhower administration after the October 1957 surprise shock of the Soviet Union launching the Sputnik satellite into orbit. It was used again after the Soviet collapse in December 1991, and then it was used again after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And now, with the onset of, again, what I call COVID-Ageddon, it would seem like a good time to enter door number 4 and to see if the net assessment methodology could once again be pressed into service to quick assess the implications of what we are going through right now. And I'll come back later to sort of answer the question that I've just foreshadowed. Is there a net assessment operation right now that's designed to understand the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for the Department of Defense, for assessing the future international security environment and how the U.S. Department of Defense and the rest of the government would be wise to react to it? I'll come back to that. But first, let's just talk about what net assessment really is. The nature of the activity, I think, can be described by reference to just 3 very simple observations. First, it's essentially a planning exercise. And all planning exercises, in a sense, are flings into futurology. And I think it's fair to say that defense planning and net assessment version of defense planning is kind of a subzone or subdomain of futurology. And what we have to all understand about planning and futurology in general is that these are heuristic exercises. All right? They are not designed to predict a particular future. They don't try to say, this is how things are going to be exactly in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. That's not what a heuristic exercise is for. And the way that President Eisenhower used to understand what that meant, what a heuristic exercise meant, he was fond of quoting the German general von Moltke, who said that it's not the plan that matters, it's the planning that matters. The plan is the first casualty of war. It falls at first contact with reality, always. But the planning makes the mind and the organization more nimble, flexible, able to react quickly and effectively to novelty. So planning is a training exercise for human capital, whatever else it is. The second thing that net assessment is a social activity. It's a group phenomenon. It's not about some guy or some woman sitting in a room, some genius all by his or her lonesome being a genius. The methodology aims to dynamically synergize different kinds of expertise into one synoptic product set. That's what it does. And this requirement sizes the effort. You can't have too many people involved, and you can't have too few. The other element that sizes the effort, of course, is time. Now, time is never free. Even in normal, non-radical discontinuity circumstances, the Office of Net Assessment operates on a schedule that is married to the Department of Defense acquisition calendar, which in turn is tied into the congressional authorization and appropriations calendars. So people don't just sit around and write memos and stuff and have all the time in the world. That's not how it works. But in a situation of urgency, like now, or after 9/11, or after the collapse of the Soviet Union, time becomes a far more pressing and constrained and hence shaping variable to how a net assessment exercise is planned and how it works out. So you've got to find the mean between complacency and panic. And one of the things in general that this kind of planning exercise does is it tries to rationalize reactions to novelty, right? If you look around right now, you look at the periodic literature that is spilling out all over the place, it's very fractionated. It's all over the wall. People tend to, sort of recycle their pet concerns. And a lot of the analysis you see is very narrow. It's not synoptic. It doesn't try to take into consideration other ways of thinking. It's very hard for any one person, no matter how bright they may be, to do this kind of thing. It is a group activity. It is time constrained. And the other thing that's important, the combination of, how do you find the mean between complacency and panic? How do you synergize different kinds of expertise in a single exercise, right? This doesn't come in a kind of an easy to assemble set of directions. It requires basically two things. It requires leadership of an exercise like this, and it requires non or depoliticization. And let me stress the latter. You simply cannot have political heavies trying to interfere or torque an intelligence process, a net assessment process, or any other IC process for selfish or parochial reasons. If that happens, the process will fail. So we're dealing, in essence, with applied sociology, a very narrow province of applied sociology. And we know something about what kinds of groups work, from studies of the Bell Labs in its heyday, from studies of DARPA, and other groups that are explicitly designed to generate innovation. And there's a significant, if not exactly vast, professional literature on this very subject. Now, of course, at NTU, here at the university, all of this is pretty well understood. There are multidisciplinary innovation labs here on campus that seek the same kind of results, best described as something that ends up being more than the sum of the parts. That's what a synergistic exercise is. That's what net assessment seeks to be able to produce on these specific issues of rapid discontinuous change. What it really is trying to do, in a sense, is to predict state changes. And if you know any physics, you know what I mean by a state change. A state change in physics is when a substance moves from a solid to a liquid to a gas. So that metaphor, I think, is very useful. When there are crises of the sort that we're experiencing right now, it's a very complex system that one is dealing with, lots of moving parts, and it almost invariably produces some kind of state change. So you can't extrapolate simply and directly from past experience as to what a radical discontinuity like this is likely to produce. You have to be smarter than that, better than that, farther out ahead of that happens. So another way to think about or talk about the purpose of net assessment, what it's really for, is that it's basically the anti-groupthink. If you don't know what groupthink is, it's very important that you figure it out. One way to do it is to get a hold of the original book by Irving Janis called Victims of Groupthink and study it. Not just read it, study it. Even if you just have time to look at the first and last chapters, it will do you a lot of good if you haven't already experienced that book. Anti-groupthink precautions are necessary, and especially so in time-pressured radical discontinuity contingencies. Why is that? Because cognitive science teaches us that there are some aspects of normal human cognitive functioning under pressure of a crisis that are not exactly optimal. Let's put it that way. The human mind does some things that make it hard to see things clearly. Let me just mention a few, four, specifically to give you a basic idea and to show you why letting these kinds of cognitive tendencies run wild without hope of control can lead to disastrous consequences. Things like, for example, the outbreak of the First World War. So these four concerns are, and let me just list them, the switching focus problem, the incrementalism problem, the rule obsession problem, and the heroic aversion to detail problem. So let's just go very quickly in order of these four. So first, especially during a crisis, the mind has difficulty switching focus. It must either apprehend what is near or what is far off, what seems urgent or what is ultimately most important, but it has a really hard time combining the two. What happens to people under stress and under time pressure is a kind of tunnel vision, a kind of an obsession descends on most people's minds. It resembles OCD syndrome in some respects, a kind of mental freezing up, basically. These are all normal reactions to stress and anxiety, and unless you condition for them and watch for them, these are the natural tendencies of people trying to figure stuff out in a difficult, like almost panic kind of circumstance. Net assessment is the discipline involved in net assessment is designed to force combining the two, combining various perspectives into a balanced perspective. Now, the second area is incrementalism, which amounts to making gestures towards solving a problem without really solving it. You know, it's human nature for people to feel like they want to do something, but without taking a lot of risks or committing oneself to a course of action that one isn't sure of. You know, it's like leaving graham cracker crumbs on the path to find one's way back from the deep woods, in case instead of finding grandma's house, you find a witch that wants to bake you into brownies. So it's not a good strategy under most circumstances, and it's certainly not a good strategy now. What net assessment discipline does is it tries to dispel that risk aversion form of dangerous hesitation so that decision makers can act on the basis of information without courting the danger of incrementalism. To give you an example, early on in the pandemic in the United States, there was a variation on this theme. Restrictions were put on people's movements incrementally. For example, bans on groups larger than 250 people, and then after a little while on groups larger than 50 people, and then groups larger than 10 people. So this reminded me of graduated response during the Vietnam War, which made no sense. And this was especially curious because there was an article in Science that showed pretty early on, in January even, how asymptomatic disease carriers were the infection source for almost 80% of then documented cases. Now, this article came out on March 13th, but it was available and given to the CDC on February 17th. Right? The article showed that healthy people were unknowingly infecting others, which helped to explain the infection's rapid spread. And its findings recommended stiff restrictions on group size very early on, but that's not what happened. Instead, the bureaucracy engaged in a more gradual ramping up of the restrictions, as if officials wanted to avoid doing anything too radical, but still doing something. But what was something was not what was necessary. Slowness can be fatal in pandemics, and it obviously has been. Third, I think quite interesting, is this reverence for rules, another tendency. The reverence for rules had huge effects at the FDA. For example, somebody with a brain should have relaxed the rules for making masks and other personal protection equipment early on, given the gravity and the urgency of the situation. But a rule is a rule, and bureaucrats love rules, and they did not relax these requirements, and it turned out to be not a good idea. Now, why is this? Because a rule has a steadying influence on people, especially people who might be a little young or maybe a little bit shaky professionally. It's human nature. When the rule has detailed instructions for how to proceed, and when it includes penalties, if those instructions are ignored, okay, then a rule becomes on one side a security blanket and on the other side a threat. Now, here's how one of my colleagues, Ron Dworkin, put it in a wonderful article recently, and I'll tell you the title of it. It was called Diagnosing America's Pandemic Response. It was in the American interest, of course. It's an excellent piece. If you have time, you can look it up. And this is what he writes. Reverence for rules is a curious trait of human nature, of the kind that leads to idolatry. People hate to live in doubt, so they create a binding rule to tell them what to do and to how to live. Once the rule is created, people forget that the rule was of their own making and something that can be amended. They simultaneously worship the rule and fear flouting it. Not only does following the rule ease their doubts about what course of action to take, it also absolves them of guilt if things go wrong later on. At the same time, people fear repercussions if they disobey the rule. A good government official needs the inner strength to resist falling in love with a rule. Unfortunately, there are a lot of government officials that have not been able to resist the strength to fall in love with the rule. And the larger the government, the more standard operating procedures there are in it, the larger the size of the individual bureaucracies, the more rule-bound it is, the more lawyers there are all over the place, the more difficult it is for decision makers to follow their own sense of common sense. It was a good example of this early in the pandemic in the United States. There was a whistleblower report that workers from the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families were greeting infected Americans flown back from Wuhan face to face at airports where they arrived. One of these incidents was captured on video. The workers were not trained in infection control. They weren't wearing masks. They didn't have any hand sanitizers. They didn't concern themselves with the airflow in the building. And yet their duties were so inherently kindly and seemingly harmless that it was no surprise that the officials overlooked how they might impetuously greet infected Americans, hugging them and kissing them and shaking their hands and carrying their luggage. The result was that many of these workers became infected themselves and then blithely and unknowingly left the airports and infected others. Now, we don't know how many events like this occurred. There were probably several, but there were other examples. Cheryl Bernard, a woman I know who's the wife of Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, returned to Dulles Airport in either late January or early February from Vienna. And she described the scene at Dulles Airport in an article in the Washington Post. And, I was in Singapore at the time, and I already understood what was going on a little bit way before Americans, about 4 weeks before most Americans sort of got wind of what this really was about. And it was horrifying. I mean, Dulles Airport is always horrifying, but this was really horrifying, more than usual. No precautions were taken whatsoever. People were stuffed in line right behind one another. It was hot. It was all. I encourage you to look up the article and read what Cheryl had to say, because it is absolutely horrifying. Good government officials do not overlook details. Rather than enjoy knowledge of reality from afar when making policy, they have to enter reality, right? So this takes practical application of imagination that's central to competent planning and to competent operations. They focus on details based, for lack of a better way to say it, on an integrated theory of mind. They have to know what's in other people's heads in order to do that effectively. Now, doing that takes a lot of effort, and it can be very tiresome and complicated. In addition, just thinking about restraining people from hugging, greeting, and enjoying each other's company at an airport, it's repellent to human nature to do that. And yet that kind of methodical work, which means victory after victory in the smallest aspects of a crisis, including overcoming the gravitational pull of human nature, that's what successful policies turn on. That's what a lot of people in Singapore understand, for having gone through SARS and having gone through other public health crises. That's what people have learned the hard ways. The United States hasn't had a public health crisis of this kind for 100 years, since the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, 1919. And we're way behind the learning curve. Net assessment methodology, if it's applied by competent leaders and managers, is sensitive to all four of these and more natural human pratfalls. So now, what does a net assessment scheme actually look like? We really don't have time to go into great detail about this, but as I mentioned before, as a heuristic planning exercise, the methodology eschews point predictions. And instead, what it's really aiming for is a range of outcomes, each with probability markers assigned to them. And it does this in part by distinguishing between stochastic risk and structural uncertainty. Let me try to explain what I mean by that by telling you a little story. And I can see already the time is passing so fast I can't believe it. So let me just tell you the story. So imagine a fisherman. Let's say he's in China, all right? Why not China? A fisherman goes out one day to the river where he's been fishing for a long time. And that fisherman has brought his bait, and he's brought his tackle, and he's brought his line, he's brought his equipment. And every day that he goes out, he knows that he's going to take some risks. Fish might not be biting. The weather might turn foul. His bait might be no good. He might snag his line. All right? He throws in his line anyway, does the best he can. That's risk. If the fisherman walks out one morning to the river and he finds out that the river's not there anymore because there's been an earthquake or a landslide upstream and the course of the river has been diverted, a very rare occurrence to be sure, but one with high impact on what he's doing, trying to fish, right? That's not risk. That's uncertainty, okay? Another way to put it to people who know a little statistics is that if you're talking about stochastic risk, risk means you know the formula. You just don't know the magnitude that you have to assign to the variables in the formula. Uncertainty means that you don't know the formula. You don't know what the variables are that make up the formula. Now, these are two very different kinds of uncertainties. And the beginning of wisdom in designing a net assessment effort, a net assessment planning exercise, is to know the difference between stochastic risk and uncertainty. And at times when you're really looking for some leverage in dealing with something like COVID-19, what you really want to do is privilege your study of structural uncertainty and follow it, layer on top of that problems and questions having to do with mere risk. So for example, in the current case, risk, we don't know how long COVID-19 will last. We don't know the kind of patterns it might sketch in the future, year or 2 years. We don't know if it'll just disappear like SARS did, more or less. It could happen. How long it will go on, how it will affect various economies, how it will affect global connectivity of supply chains. Those are risk kinds of things, all right? But structural uncertainty is very different. We don't know if there'll be second and third waves of infection that could be much larger, that could combine, for example, with the normal flu season and create like a perfect storm of overburdening hospital systems. We don't know, for example, if there will be regime collapses or civil wars breaking out. We do know that the crisis will unfold in four phases. There's the medical epidemiological aspects of it. Then there's the economic aspects of it, which are already thick and heavy upon us. Then there will be a series of differential domestic political consequences. And then that will combine into an international geopolitical consequence. We know all that. And we know that these four aspects of the sequence will recombine after all are unfurled, and they will combine in strange and unpredictable waves, like waves in an ocean. All right, but they will double back, so that, for example, if there are political and geopolitical radical discontinuities, that will double back on the extent to which the second or third coming of the virus can be contained and controlled. So this is a very complex issue, and the way that a system to understand it is developed has to be iterative. In other words, it has to include the doubling back of patterns once the early phases of the phenomenon are exhausted. Let's just take a quick example. I know I'm running out of time already. From the European Union, okay? A couple of factors are easy to lay out when it comes to the EU. One is that is concerned with demography. European demography is so thin right now. It's gotten to the point where a demographic rebound is very hard to imagine. It's very difficult, for example, to imagine the members of the European Union mounting a consumption-driven economic rebound, stimulus programs on the scale of that which the United States has already done and will continue to do. In the long run, protection against pandemic visitations, the Europeans are not likely to have that tool. So Europe, in a way, has aged into an export union. And now in an age of deglobalization, movement restrictions, and financial and economic constrictions, there are a lot fewer markets to export to. So the Europeans must shelter in place until the world opens up again. And what it means essentially is that the EU cannot act as an independent variable. It is dependent on what others do. More than that, the virus has forced the Europeans to abandon free movement of peoples to a considerable extent. Its financial shortfalls will likely force the abandonment of the free movement of capital. The mass renationalization of policies will probably force the abandonment of the free movement of goods, at least to some extent. Now, that's 3 of the 4 freedoms of movement that the European Union has depended on. The one that's left, the free movement of services, can remain, but what would you be servicing? If the other 3 things don't move like they did, what can you service? So if you do, this is just a very snapshot, sort of back of the envelope exercise. If those things are all true, or to the extent to which they're true, what can you predict out of this? What semi-solid conclusion can you reach? One conclusion that I think you could reach is that the euro is toast, because it makes differential national adjustments to this new reality very difficult and very painful. I, for example, don't expect the euro to survive the current crisis in its current form. Exactly what form it will take, whether it will survive at all, how many countries will be a party to it, that's something that experts on Europe need to talk about. That's not me. Can we see the slide now? Can somebody pull up the slide? I have a slide here that's a little peculiar. The slide anywhere? Anybody? Slide? There we go. So here's a schematic of a net assessment theoretical exercise. You can see what it's about. It's about the invasion of alien species, all right? This is not that far off because, a lot of scientists believe that a virus, like most water on the planet, actually came from outer space. Maybe a long time ago, but it came from outer space. So you see, I'm not going to keep the diagram up for long. I don't want to distract you with it. But you see basically how it loops around and how it flows. And I want to draw your attention to what I guess would be on the right side. See those overlapping like folders or little arcs on the right-hand side. So in this diagram, those are the names of species or the names of biological phenomenon. But if you were going to try to adapt this flowchart, this slide, to a net assessment on COVID-19, which would want to put perhaps in those displace those labels on the right-hand side, you'd be wanting to put the kinds of phenomenon that this pandemic is likely to affect. We've already mentioned one of them, the effect on terrorist groups. Terrorist groups might find ways to take advantage of the distractions and relocation of government focus right now. Some perhaps contemplating the deliberate use of bioweapons now that they've seen how effective biological terrorism, not terrorism, biological disruptions can be. It's going to drive domestic political balances in democracies toward extreme positions. It's going to further hollow out the center. So you have to ask yourself, what will be the political trajectory of democratic countries? It's going to feed anti-immigrant xenophobia. It's going to exacerbate the circle the wagons mentality in many countries. It already is. It's going to cause food shortages and disruptions in the chain of food supplies in many places. It's going to have fairly dramatic political effects. Same way that what Americans call the Great Recession did in 2007, 2008. It's going to affect commodity prices, not just oil, but many other commodity prices. It's going to dramatically affect debt, national debt in many countries, certainly the United States. It's going to affect defense budgets, are going to differ according to the system. It's going to affect privacy issues in many countries that matter. It's going to affect crime and policing protocols. And that in turn is going to affect political opinion. It's going to affect immigration policies. It's going to affect labor profiles. You get the idea, right? So what you'd really need to study the integrated analysis of all of these side and after effects of the pandemic, you'd need a 7 or an 8 or a 9 factor model so that you could assess how each of these affects one another, how they clump together, how they cluster. If you could amass the relevant data, you mostly can't, especially if you're trying to do it in a hurry, then what you would do is a standard set of regression analyses to establish relative weight. Because as every social scientist knows, it's easy to list the factors than it is to establish their interrelations and to ascribe relative weights in explaining the variance in any given circumstance. Okay, so I think we can take the slide down now. And if you want the slide, you can have it. So final thing I want to say about the nature of the net assessment exercise is that it tries to proceed as close to real time as possible. So if you're doing an exercise like this, you got the model laid out. What you'll want to be able to do is funnel new information. Once that new information is verified or handicapped tentatively according to the degree of likely accuracy, you want to be able to feed that into the model, which then changes the probability rankings of the causal sequences that have been built into the model. And you want to continue to reappraise the model and adjust the model as necessary as you go. So this is an iterative process from beginning to end. And of course, if you apply this to the COVID-19 crisis, those basic layers, again, would move from medical uncertainties to uncertain economic impacts, to the social implications, to the political consequences within countries, to the political consequences for the international system of a whole, and so on and so forth. Again, as I mentioned before, all would have to be recursively set against one another. Okay. It's very important, finally, I know I can see the time here, it's very important, finally, to not be mesmerized by numbers. So I just mentioned before, when you do these exercises, you're looking for, if you can find it, some kind of an empirical basis. But it's impossible. It's impossible to chart these things solidly from fragmented numerical or empirical data. And in a crisis where there's time constraints, you're never going to get a full data set that's reliable from which you can directly extrapolate conclusions. It's just never going to happen. So I like to quote Nietzsche here, who once said that were it not for the constant counterfeiting of the world by means of numbers, men could not live. A wiser thing was perhaps never said. So remember, it's a heuristic exercise. It requires prudential judgment. It requires a kind of leadership, and it requires essentially cold-bloodedness. It requires what the exercise enables you to do in the context of other experts trying to scull this out together. It enables you to get hold of the emotional vortex that crises like this always draw people into. And let me just describe to you, if I can, what the opposite is of a cold-blooded, analytical, careful, balanced, internally B-teamed and interrogated exercise is. What the opposite of a careful net assessment exercise is ideological thinking. And I'm describing ideological thinking here in a very specific way, and I want to quote it from a colleague. The ideologue flies beyond territory that has yet to be colonized by careful observation. His or her belief system allows decisions to be made with haste because generalizations sweep past details. In ideology, a single study that relies on only a few variables is presumed to represent with sufficient exactitude a very complex situation. It explains why the ideologue so often fails in real life. The ideologue thinks, but thinking is easy. Putting thoughts into action is much, much harder. Real life presents innumerable variables and details that must be accounted for, which is why it is easier to write 10 books of philosophy than it is to put one principle into practice. Close quote. Ideological thinking causes all kinds of dangerous distortions from rationality in a crisis. The best book to start learning about this is the classic 1976 book by Robert Jervis called Perception and Misperception in International Relations. And many of you, no doubt, know this book. And if you do, that's good. If you don't know about it and you care about the subject, then that's not good. You need to know about it. Jervis talks about many things. And let me just briefly mention two of them. He mentioned something called the evoked set. We don't call it the evoked set much anymore. The current parlance for that same concept, or something very similar to it, is called confirmation bias. And the second thing that's relevant here that he talks about is something called the dominant strategy. Now, what does this mean? Evoked set or confirmation bias just means that people see what they expect to see, and they don't see what they don't expect to see. And that's not a very good way to parse evidence objectively. You've got to guard against that kind of bias, right? A cold-blooded net assessment exercise helps you to do that, okay? What is a dominant strategy? A dominant strategy is an idée fixe, as they say in French. It means that people panicked, that they decide that they're going to do a certain thing, regardless of what an adversary, either an adversary with agency does, or in this case, a virus does. They're going to do what they're going to do regardless of what anybody else does. That's like sitting down to play a game of chess, right? And deciding how you're going to play the game of chess without regard at all to what your opponent is doing. Guess what? You're going to lose if you do that. But there's a cognitive tick, you might say, in some people, certain kinds of personalities, that tie them down to a dominant strategy in a situation where being nimble and being able to adjust to new information and to new developments is absolutely critical. So both of these cognitive tics are very dangerous. They're characteristic of ideological thinking, driving out analytical thinking. And basically what you want to do in true analytical thinking is you want to create a balance between inductive and deductive forms of reasoning. Deductive forms of reasoning can be empirical. Inductive forms of reasoning very often can't be. That's why I said before, you must be mesmerized by the few numbers that you may have at your disposal. So I'm going to stop there. Except I want to answer the question that I raised in the very beginning. You might think that net assessment right now in the Pentagon is adjusting its typical methodology to study how it might adjust, first of all, to changes in the defense budget coming up, to changes in the international environment because of the second and third order consequences of the crisis, what the acquisition strategy might look like. You might think that the United States, that ONA is doing that right now. You might think that the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, is trying to organize, or the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Right now we have an acting director, only an acting director of national intelligence. You might think that they're trying to organize on all sources. There are 16 different parts of the IC, the intelligence community in the United States, 16, that they're trying to organize on all sources, all agencies' study of the broad effects of COVID-19. But these aren't normal times in the United States. So I asked some people, I won't tell you who they are. I asked somebody who worked with Andy Marshall at Net Assessment for 30 years. I asked a former acting director of the CIA, I know pretty well. I asked a couple of people, people on the staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee, because they would be apprised of these exercises if they were ongoing. So what do you think the answers that I got are? The answer in short is, of course, they can't tell me. My senior executive service credentials and my SCI clearances are no longer operative, so I don't have a need to know. But the body language told me that this isn't happening. The United States is, in fact, not operating its intelligence community right now to its capacity. And why is this? It's because in recent years, 15 years or so, the relationship between senior policymakers and the intelligence community has become slightly unhinged. It's become reactive. In other words, the intelligence community, whatever its capabilities may be to understand various kinds of problems and situations, it can't really function properly unless senior decision makers ask it to. It's become a demand pull kind of activity. This was not the case when Dwight Eisenhower was president, but it's become the case in more recent years. It's become the case in part because of the politicization of aspects of the intelligence process in the United States. And now we have a situation where we know who the president is in the United States. A fellow named Richard Grenell is the acting DNI, the acting director of national intelligence. And these are people who claim that there is a deep state conspiracy against the Trump administration, and the deep state, it's in its various layers, the absolute core of the deep state, in their minds, this is what they say, is the intelligence community. And now we have somebody who buys into that, that theory, who is the acting director of national intelligence. To say that this is an unusual circumstance is to say that a California redwood is kind of a large tree. This is a very unusual circumstance. I don't think anybody really understands what it means, but just to conclude, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. So I'll stop there and see if we have questions I can handle in the next 15, 20 minutes or so.
Right. Thanks very much. Learn a lot from the presentation. We have some questions coming in. I would like to encourage other those who are watching to put in more questions if you like, the YouTube chat box. I'll start off with one of the very interesting questions, which I think comes to the nub of the issue for Adam. This questioner is asking about the 2014 Defense Department QDR report, right? That did not mention the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which occurred in 2014. So this question essentially is, does this represent a failure of net assessment, which essentially ties in with what I wanted to ask, which is what can be reasonably expected of the net assessment process? I mean, it's not a crystal ball exercise, right? So, I mean, what kind of expectations should we have?
Right. Well, let me just clarify. Maybe I wasn't too clear. Net assessment is part of the intelligence community's sort of repertoire of planning and projection tools. What net assessment is in the Defense Department, and its main function, as I mentioned, the three functions, is to help the acquisition and strategy people decide what kinds of weapons to buy, and when to buy them, and in what quantities to buy them, and how to match them to missions. All right. So it's not a whole of government. It's not a political or a strategic planning cell. It is focused largely on the acquisition system. What I was trying to say is that the methodology, however, can be adapted and used for other purposes. And it has been taken out of ONA at various times in the past and used in conjunction with other methods to do other things. So you wouldn't expect, therefore, a planning cell in the Department of Defense to be able to predict the Russian invasion of Crimea. That's not what it's for. If you wanted to predict that, you'd have to be asking about the integration of other elements in the intelligence community, specifically the CIA, NSA, and the Air Force Recon Office. So you'd have human intelligence, mainly in the CIA, and other aspects of intelligence in the CIA, sort of normal collections and analysis, is what it's called, which is 90% of what the CIA does. There are a lot of movies out there that show, hotshot operations, CIA operations. That's a very, very tiny fraction of what the budget for the Central Intelligence Agency actually covers. Most of what the CIA does is actually quite boring compared to what you see in the movies. The National Security Agency, of course, is about SIGINT, signal intelligence. It's the largest single part of the IC. And of course, DIA, what Defense Intelligence Agency does, is it looks at other countries' military forces and tries to monitor how large they are, how they train, what their doctrine is, what they do, how they liaise with other militaries. So all of those agencies are the ones that would be responsible for creating competent products, to do something like foretell the Russian seizure of Crimea. But there have been lots and lots of episodes in the history of American intelligence where things were missed. For example, the so-called Indian PNE, Peaceful Nuclear Explosion of 1974, the American intelligence community completely missed it. You almost never hear about that. There are lots of things that they just completely missed. A lot of times the CIA has been excoriated for not understanding the weakness of the Soviet economy toward the end of the Soviet Union, and that actually is not true. They had that pretty well down. They missed a lot of other things, but the intelligence process is not just about predicting discrete events. There are different kinds of predictions, different kinds of assessments that intelligence agencies produce, and it's much easier to do kind of a broad trend analysis than it is to predict that a certain thing is going to happen on Tuesday morning at 6:30. I mean, that's very hard to do. Almost no intelligence agency, unless it has exquisitely placed human intelligence, can do something like that. So it's really not fair. It would be fair to say that the U.S. intelligence community screwed up by not thinking about the possibility of a Russian invasion or seizure, occupation of Crimea. That would be fair. But to say that it's somehow, it's a cardinal sin not to have predicted the very day that it was going to happen, that's quite unfair. So you have to understand that intelligence projections aren't, there are different dimensions of them. They go on at different levels. And the more precise and specific time-wise you expect an agency to get, the harder it is to do that effectively. I hope that answers the question.
Well, thanks, Adam. Another related question is, I think it's a fair question. The whole net assessment methodology has been around for decades, and yet this questioner has a good point. Governments are still surprised. Is this, in your view, due to a lack of will and resources to actually translate these scenarios to strategies?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I think in order to get a really confident and reliable answer, you'd have to ask it of somebody who spent at least 10 years working in DoD. I did work essentially, my checks were signed by the Secretary of Defense for 3 years of my career, but I didn't have a line position inside the Defense Department, so I'm really not the right person to ask. It's one thing for an intelligence agency or a cell to kind of get things right, but in order for what they know to be effectively integrated into high-level policy, as I mentioned earlier, senior decision makers have to ask it, okay? And they have to be able to ask the questions properly in order to get the answers that they want. It used to be, as I mentioned, President Eisenhower would meet with the intelligence, according to the memoirs and the records back from the 1950s. When President Eisenhower would meet with these people, he would sometimes end a meeting with his NSC or with his intelligence people by saying, okay, what question should I have asked you that I didn't ask you, that I should have asked you, that I need to know, that kind of thing. It reminds you a little bit of Donnie Rumsfeld's distinction between the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? In recent years, presidents have not done that. George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, would do that from time to time, and so would General Scowcroft, who was the head of the National Security Council, the National Security. But by and large, presidents in recent times have not done that. And being an intelligence liaison to the high political leadership has become a very risk-averse kind of a thing. You don't suggest the questions that they should be asking. You just ask the questions they ask. And if they don't ask, they don't get an answer. Let me just give you an example. When I was in the State Department in policy planning in 2003, 4, 5, one of the things that I was very curious about was whether any senior decision maker, including the one that I worked for, the Secretary of State, had asked the IC what would be the consequences of displacing a Sunni government in Baghdad that had been a Sunni government since the Abbasid dynasty with a Shia government, which is, of course, what happened in the wake of the Iraq War. Anybody who knows anything about the Middle East understands that that would not be a second or third order consequence, not just for Iraq, but for the region. That would be a first order consequence, most likely. So I asked the question of a bunch of people in the State Department and over at Langley, and the answer I got did not shock me, but it dismayed me. Nobody asked. No one asked. If that surprises you, well, be surprised. It didn't surprise me. But there's an example of how, if the question isn't asked, then all the assets in the intelligence community can't be put to bear. So when there are screw-ups, don't necessarily blame just the intelligence community, right? Blame the decision makers who failed to ask the right questions, who failed to know how to use it properly. Another way to think about this problem, if Andy Marshall were alive today, he passed away about 13 months ago at the age of 97. And I used to go see Andy in his apartment in Alexandria after he had retired. And I remember very vividly the last time I saw him. It was on November 14th, 2018. And I asked him about planning. Why doesn't the United States government know how to plan effectively anymore? Why don't we plan well? Net assessment plans, it's in a limited way. But in policy planning in the State Department, policy planning doesn't happen in the State Department except rarely. It doesn't do what it did when it was created, when George Kennan and then Paul Nitze and others ran it. If we had time, I could describe to you what policy planning actually does, but we don't have time. I said, what's gone wrong with the planning function? So Andy Marshall was one of those guys who was used to asking the questions, not answering them. He was a very taciturn man. But if you got him in a room one-on-one and you asked the question and he knew the answer, he felt obligated to try to answer your question. So we had a 2-hour conversation on this question. Why doesn't the United States government take planning seriously anymore? Why doesn't it plan well? About 1 hour of the 2-hour conversation was spent with Andy silent, with his chin in his left hand, thinking. That's how he got the name Yoda. That plus the fact that he used to speak in very strange grammatical locutions. But when Andy would talk, it was definitely worth listening to. Why don't we plan well? If I had another half an hour, I could explain to you all the things that he told me. But one of them is that we've become lazy and complacent. We don't think, there's no urgency to it. We were so secure and so rich for so long that we kind of got out of the habit of having strict rigor. A second reason is that we have stopped thinking in terms of the way engineers think, in terms of mechanics. And instead, we've started thinking in the way that mathematicians think, in terms of probabilities. And that changes the whole psychology of the intelligence process. So you're not actually trying to drill down causal sequences. You're just kind of rolling the dice and saying, well, there's a certain chance this will happen. I mean, you're doing probabilistic statistical estimates instead of actually trying to lay out the causal sequence with care and detail. And it changes the whole psychology of the process. But even Andy would, I'm finally going to get to answer the question now. Even Andy would say, I'm sure if he were here, that ONA's efforts to guide the Defense Department in terms of acquisition strategy and so forth in recent years has not been successful. He was actually quite disturbed by the direction that things had taken in the last years of his tenure at ONA. And here's why. It really has to do with the Iron Triangle. You have some sexy large platforms that have lobbies both within the uniformed services and the civilians in DOD and in the defense industrial base and among politicians for whom defense industrial-related jobs in their districts and in their states are very important political assets. I mean, a lot of people realize that the F-35, the new fighter, is actually the production for the F-35 is distributed in all 50 states, and that's not a coincidence. That's politics. Now, I mean, when I talked before about the politicization of intelligence, I was talking about, what I really meant, of course, was senior political people trying to get the intelligence community to come down one way or the other on an analytical question in a way that deviates from their best judgment. This is different. This is a different kind of politicization. This is a distortion of the acquisition process so that the best military minds, planning minds, actually don't end up being able to field the array of weapon systems that they want. They end up having to field the array of weapon systems that Congress wants them to have for political reasons that have nothing to do with military strategy. Some of you may know, at least I hope so, I don't think this is classified or anything, but we do war games in the United States. It's just part of what militaries do. I'm sure that war games are undertaken in Singapore as well, and in other countries as well, most other countries. And if you, depending on how you define the scenario, if you define a Pacific scenario, a U.S.-China, Sino-American scenario, and you run these pretty fancy war games, in the last 3 or 4 years, every time you do a war game, the United States loses. Why does the United States lose? Not because it doesn't have great stuff, great weapons, not because it doesn't have effective technological superiority still over China in most respects. Not that it doesn't have, the numbers that it needs in most respects. That's not the reason at all why it fails. The reason why we fail, the reason why it loses, is because the kill chain, the association of weapon systems and command, control, and communications assets that knit them together are misaligned. And they're misaligned because a lot of the ordnance that you would want for these kinds of contingencies, the military doesn't have, and a lot of very expensive high-tech platforms that it doesn't need, it does have. So that's why in the war games, the United States keeps losing these war games. So that's a different kind of failure of intelligence, specifically a different kind of failure, specifically of what net assessment is supposed to do for the acquisition process in the Defense Department, and it's very troubling. The American people are used to winning wars, and the last time the American people, remember that kind of thing wasn't the Iraq War. I mean, look, the statue of Saddam fell after only a couple of weeks. It wasn't the war that went wrong, it was the aftermath that went wrong, phase 4. People remember the Gulf War from 1991, right? The television war, that was a resounding success. In the minds of a lot of Americans, right, typical people, the United States can basically kick ass anywhere and anybody it wants. And boy, are they going to be surprised when that turns out not to be true next time, because it's not going to be true next time. And it's not something, by the way, that U.S. allies, friends, and partners in Asia really want to hear these days. But unfortunately, it's the truth. So I hope that answers the question.
Sure. Thanks. I think we have time for one question, and I'm trying to synthesize some of the thoughts here. A lot of it seems to arise from the point you just brought up about the politicization of the intelligence process. And in fact, it ties in very well with what you were talking about earlier about, for example, dominant strategy, and you're referring to Robert Jervis' work, the evoked set confirmation bias and dominant strategy. We're just going to do what we want to do, regardless of what the adversary is actually doing. I mean, do you have any insights as to how such a tendency can be sort of like mitigated against?
Well, we have a presidential system in the United States, and if you have some kind of rogue actor with peculiar cognitive characteristics, he's just one person in a group, and unless you can mitigate the consequences if the person is even the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State, you can balance against that, because ultimately it's up to the president. But if the president is the problem, okay, it's a different issue if the president is the problem. And we have right now a president who has a dominant strategy. His dominant strategy basically is, I would say, if you think about it in terms of a recipe, if you like a recipe metaphor, it's about 3 cups of isolationism combined with about 1.5 cups of unilateralism, combined with about, I would say, 3 or 4 teaspoons of pique and a pinch of gall. That's what it is. So this president is absolutely determined to overthrow the web of institutions and alliances that have kept the world safe and out of hegemonic war and reasonably prosperous and stable for most of the period since the Second World War, in favor of a dominant strategy, which is bringing it all basically back home and creating some kind of fortress America. But how exactly you explain that in an era when there's an awful lot of interconnection and interaction, not just economic, but in so many other ways, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you know, this is a man who doesn't play chess, or if he did, he would just push the pawn and wouldn't care what the other guy was going to do in return. There's not a strategic bone in this man's head. So that's the kind of situation we're in right now, it seems to me. And frankly, if I could just prattle on for a minute or two, I'm sort of worried about it. You know, look, some people are just worriers, and I'm that kind of person. My wife is not the worrier. She's the optimist. So we have burden sharing here, okay? She's okay with the way things are, and I worry. But I am very, very concerned right now that the United States and China, both under tremendous domestic political pressure because of having to cope with a very unusual situation, are stumbling into a rapidly deteriorating relationship that could, in fact, get out of hand. And it's happening in the midst of an election campaign season in the United States, which makes the dangers even greater than they would otherwise be. I mean, I've even sort of written out a scenario, a sort of a gruesome, near worst case scenario of what could happen in the next 6 months, and it is quite gruesome. So I'm mindful of the fact that if you study international crises, I mean really morbid international political and war crises of the past, they tend to rush up and unravel very quickly. The sources of instability can take years, sometimes even decades to develop. But when things go south, they have a tendency to do so very rapidly. I mentioned in passing the onset of World War I in August 1914 a little earlier. That's an excellent example, right, of something going south in a huge hurry. And I'm worried that we are possibly moving toward such a catalytic moment. The reason I wrote out the scenario, and I can share this with those who are interested, the reason I wrote it out was not to audition for a job as Prophet of Doom. It's not a very good day job, it seems to me. The reason I did it was basically for a net assessment reason, right? Was to get people to, as we say at RSIS, to ponder the improbable so as to make our minds more nimble so that we can do the things we might need to do in a pinch to stop these terrible things from happening, all right? That's why I wrote it out. But we're in a situation where the character of the political reality, both in China and in the United States right now, are somewhat abnormal. And to me, the prospect for the situation to become accident prone is vastly higher than usual. And so it distresses me. But let me just not let that carry over into the beginning of the weekend, which is where we are, right? It's the beginning of the weekend. So before I stop talking, let me wish everybody a deliriously happy and wonderful and productive and restful and serene weekend. And hopefully maybe I'll see you, or you'll see me, I don't know, we're not really seeing each other, next Friday when I present the final one of this trio of webinars. And thank you, Dr. Kumar, for excellent moderation.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Adam Garfinkle, for guiding us expertly through this webinar on the U.S. experience of net assessment. I've had, I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot. As usual, I listened to Dr. Garfinkle last week as well, and I certainly intend to listen next week when he gives his final webinar in this series. I hope all of you have, like me, learned much from Dr. Garfinkle's webinar this afternoon, and I encourage you to sign up for the third installment in his webinar series next Friday. So with that, I add my greetings to all of you and have a good weekend. So thank you very much.
Thank you.